Hi, I'm Alex Essen, and I will be presenting on Chapter 11, which is Toward Black Liberation by Stokely Carmichael. So, really quickly, an intro on Stokely Carmichael. He was born in 1941 in Trinidad and Tobago, and he would later move to Harlem, New York when he was 11 years old. So, Carmichael began his activism in 1960 when he enrolled in Howard University. And he would later write this article, sorry, in 1966, which is based on his speech Black Power. Okay, so in this article, he splits up his focus into three main sections. The first one being explaining the issue. The second one is him talking about the past failures and attempting to correct this issue, and the last one would be him presenting his solution to the issue. Okay, so let's go over how Carmichael attempts to explain the issue. So he starts off by saying that Negroes are dependent on and at the discretion of forces and institutions within the white society. So he says this first to imply that all problems faced in black communities stem from the lack of independence and power to fix their own problems, which is a theme that he carries through the article. And then he also states that the right to create your own terms is the first necessity of a free people. He then takes a break from this point of attack to talk about how black issues are portrayed in the media, stating that the victimization of the Negro takes place in two phases. First, it occurs in fact indeed. Then he describes this to be equally sinister in the official recording of those facts. So he backs up this point by giving examples of voter suppression in Mississippi and how that was portrayed as black laziness. Okay, so he then relates this to how the press has had their way with the concept of black power, which is a term he coined. And to be fair, I would say that I agree with this because when I think of black power, some of the things it connotates would be like the Black Panthers and a lot of rioting that was going on at the time. So I would say that after reading this, I would say that what he would describe black power as was definitely misconstrued by the media. So then he then goes on to quote a statement by the National Commission of Churchmen posted in the New York Times in 1966. So it does have relevance in today's society, especially with all the things that we've seen going on with the BLM protests and everything. So some key points from the statement they put out was basically how they would say that the conscience of black men is corrupted because having no power to implement the demands of conscience. And they would back this up by saying powerlessness breeds a race of beggars. We are faced now with a situation where powerless conscience meets conscienceless power. So they're basically talking about how without the power black people need to be able to make changes in their own societies, they have turned into beggars and are very desperate, and that's probably why we can see things like riots happening. So they later say that without the capacity to participate with power, i.e. to have some organized political and economic strength to really influence people with whom one interacts, integration is not meaningful. So this is another key thing to note because Carmichael will later go into why he has problems with the notion of integration, and also this is also one of the questions from the chapter, so I would take a note of that. Okay. So he then runs off the ending of the statement to return to his initial thesis. So he states that traditionally, for each new ethnic group, the route to social and political integration into America's pluralistic society has been through the organization of their own institutions with which to represent their communal needs within the larger society. This is simply stating what he advocates for and what he sees black power to be. So then he then goes off to explain why the white community is likely to be opposed to this happening. He begins by saying that Negroes are defined by two forces, their blackness and their powerlessness. Okay, once again, this is one of the chapter questions, which we will talk more about at the end. So he doesn't really expand on this, but I feel as though he does later on in his article. So he then begins to talk about the political, economic, and social dichotomy between the white community and the black community, stating that the white community has been the one that has controlled and defined the forms of all institutions within the society, whilst the black community was excluded from participation in power decisions, making sure to emphasize that this isn't an accident or a coincidence. He then clarifies that this hasn't been done by individual acts of racism from white people to black people, rather a more systematic injustice. And he gives powerful examples of how a white terrorist bombing a Negro church, killing 5 children, is an example of individual racism, but 500 Negro babies dying each year because of a lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities in the same city of Birmingham, Alabama, as an example of institutionalized racism. So this just puts into scale just how dire the issue is. He then goes on to theorize that the ghetto is a product of a combination of forces and special interests in the white community, and the groups that have access to the resources and power to change the situation benefit politically and economically from the existence of that ghetto. This is why the idea of black power is so important to him. He feels that you can't rely on the goodness of people in power, as they will always work in their own self-interest. You must acquire the power over your community and bring prosperity to yourself. He tries to support this statement by saying that one will find the same combination of political, economic, and social forces at work, expanding by saying that people living in these communities do not control the resources of that community, nor do they control its political decisions, its law enforcement, its housing standards, and even the physical ownership of the land, houses, and stores. Carmichael says that Negroes must endure the oppression of these communities because they are black and powerless. So once again, he comes back to this notion of being black and powerless, which I will talk about at the end when going over the chapter questions. Okay, so at this point, Carmichael switches his attention towards what he deems to be the past failures in attempting to correct this issue. So he introduces a solution concocted by some articulate Negroes and their white allies and by liberals, for whom he does appear to have a great disdain towards. So he defines integration by saying that according to the advocates of integration, social justice will be accomplished by integrating the Negro into the mainstream institutions of the society from which he has previously been excluded from. Carmichael then begins to criticize integration by saying that it is in terms of the Negro, the individual Negro, rather than in terms of the community. He then says, and this is also very important to remember, he says that this concept of integration had to be based on the assumption that there was nothing of value in the Negro community and that little of value could be created among Negroes. So the thing to do was to siphon off the acceptable Negroes into the surrounding middle-class white community. Thus, the goal of the movement of integration was to simply loosen up restrictions barring the entry of Negroes into the white community. He says that this shouldn't be the goal, and that the Negro community should instead strive for collective power. He delves further into the thinking behind integration by saying the theory was that without attempting to create any organized base of political strength itself, the civil rights movement could, by forming coalitions with various liberal pressure organizations in the white community, such as liberal reform groups, labor unions, church groups, or even progressive civic groups, and at times either or major political party. So by doing all of this, their goal was to influence national legislation and national social patterns. He then identifies the failings of this solution by stating that we all have seen the limitations of this approach. We have repeatedly seen that political alliances based on appeals to conscience and decency are chancy things, simply because institutions and political organizations have no consciences outside their own special interests. He then theorizes that these so-called allies won't keep the same energy when the rights of black people conflict with their own special interests. He uses the deterioration of the Reconstruction period to prove his point. He attempts to add more depth to this point by sarcastically talking about the potential successes of integration when he says that What has the movement for integration accomplished to date? The Negro graduating from MIT with a doctorate will have a better job opportunity available to him than to Lyndon Bird Johnson, who was the daughter of President Lyndon B. Johnson. He also says, but the rate of unemployment in the Negro community is steadily increasing, while that in the white community decreases. So he says this to kind of show the contrast in what is actually needed and what integration brings about. So he therefore concludes that even if integration was successfully implemented, its results would be not to develop the black community as a functional and honorable segment of the total society with its own cultural identity, life patterns, and institutions, but to abolish that. Okay, so he then transfers his attention towards what he thinks would be the most effective solution when he compares the difference between the solutions by saying the racial and cultural personality of the black community must be preserved and the community must win its freedom while preserving its cultural integrity. This is the essential difference between integration as it is currently practiced in the concept of black power. He begins to advocate for the need for black power by defending the media biases against it, which he mentions before by saying, "We will continue to have riots. These are not the products of black power, but of the absence of any organization capable of giving the community the power, the black power, to deal with its problems." He then debunks another misconception about the term black power when he says the standard argument presented against independent political organization is that people would say that they are only 10% of the population. And then he says that he cannot see the relevance of this observation since no one is talking about taking over the country, but taking control over our own communities. He then again criticizes integration by exposing the political effects it has on the black community when he says the time-honored practice of giving certain offices to selected Negroes. The machine thus creates a little machine, which is subordinate and responsive to it. In the Negro community, these Negro political leaders are really vote deliverers, more responsible to the white machine and the white power structure than to the community they allegedly represent. So he's basically saying that if the authority and power of these leaders comes from the white people who put them in this position, then they're only accountable to those white people. So he then gives his detailed description of what black power is and why it is a requisite of the black community. And I'll read this out because I feel like it's a very important part of his article and it's really the core of his argument. So he says, "We must organize black community power to end these abuses and to give the Negro community a chance to have its needs expressed. A leadership which is truly responsible, not to the white press and power structure, but to the community. Such leadership will recognize that its power lies in the unified and collective strength of that community. This will make it difficult for the white leadership group to conduct its dialogue with individuals in terms of patronage and prestige, and will force them to talk about the community's representatives in terms of real power. The single aspect of the Black Power program that has encountered most criticism is this concept of independent organization. This is presented as third-partyism, which has never worked, or a withdrawal into black nationalism and isolationism. If such a program is developed, it will not have the effect of isolating the Negro community, but actually the reverse. When the Negro community is able to control local office and negotiate with other groups from a position of organized strength, the possibility of meaningful political alliances on specific issues will be increased. That is a rule of politics, and there is no reason why it should not operate here. The only difference is that we will have the power to define the terms of these alliances. Okay, so after this, he then begins to strengthen his stance by relaying how it would work, stating that because of segregation, blacks are placed strategically, and that in the next 3 decades from that time, black communities in certain cities will be strong enough in number needed to give themselves power in their communities, even despite mass attempts to stop this from happening, such as gerrymandering. So he also says organized and powerful communities able to make constructive contributions to the total society would be the goal of Black Power. Okay, so now let's go over some of the chapter questions. So the first one, according to Carmichael, what are some of the accomplishments of the civil rights movement for integration? So as we said before, he feels as if the civil rights movement for integration mainly brought about the success for a few, and it meant only a few could be able to move into white suburban communities. So he wasn't really impressed with it, as he's more of an advocate for collective power. So number two, what are some of the products of Black Power? So well, it's basically in the title, towards Black liberation. He feels like Black liberation can only be achieved with Black Power. So that's what he would say would be the product of Black Power. So the third question, is integration the final solution to the Negro problem? So based on his readings, he would say no. So he is not a fan at all of integration. He feels it's a disguised assimilation, as he doesn't feel like it would bring about any liberation towards Black people as a community. But okay, so for number four, what are some of the issues facing Black communities and how can these issues be dealt with? So Carmichael would say that the main issue the Black community faces is the fact that they do not have the power to fix their issues. He would obviously also say that gaining that power is the key to solving this issue. But he would also add on to that by saying that Black unity is also required in order to successfully fight for this power. Okay, and for the last question, according to Carmichael, Negroes are defined by two forces. Outline and explain these forces. Okay, so Carmichael clearly states the Negroes are defined by two forces, their blackness and their powerlessness. He later on says that the vast majority of Negroes in this country live in these captive communities and must endure these conditions of oppression because and only because they are black and powerless. So, taking from these two quotes, it could be inferred that defined by, Carmichael is talking about a person's relationship with their society. And from the Black person's perspective, if this relationship is one that is negative and full of oppression, you have to look back to those two forces and change something. Well, a Black person cannot change that they're Black, but they can definitely change that they're powerless. And this is why Carmichael enforces Black power. Well, that's it. I hope you took something from this. Thank you for your time and attention. Bye.